So, good morning. We're going to go ahead and start. Today, we're going to be talking about finding effective treatments for COVID-19. And it's not just, we're not going to be listing a bunch of different treatments. We will mention some of those at the end, but this is more the coordinated effort that's beginning in this space. Has already begun. In fact, if you look, there are hundreds of randomized clinical trials that are getting started. There's discussion about randomized clinical trials versus EUAs, emergency use authorization. There's actually an editorial in JAMA, the Journal of the AMA, looking at that. You know, everybody loves to hate on somebody, and a lot of docs, myself included, love to hate on the AMA, but I'm not going to get into that. I'll just say that the AMA, the JAMA, Journal of the AMA, is it's a great medical journal. And so we'll cover a little bit about the processes. Again, how we're coordinating or not coordinating the randomized clinical trials, the clinical trials to get set up for treatments for COVID-19. One of the terms that you'll hear is that right now, it's not a symphony, it's more of a cacophony. In other words, it's just chaos. Everybody's trying to do whatever. And, you know, that's not that terrible. That's what we've done since time immemorial. We're just now getting our heads wrapped around how to coordinate clinical trials. Now, there are a lot of folks that would argue with me on that, especially the folks at the NIH who are responsible for doing this, but we can have that debate later. Upcoming topics, Joe Riley sent me a very interesting article. I've been meaning to mention this, and I never have mentioned it yet. It's called pulse oximetry. It's a tiny little device that you put on your finger, and it tells you how your oxygen saturation is. Now, why is that? That's been a major turnaround. When 30 years ago, when I did my internship, we didn't have that. And it's become a staple part of managing patients, especially patients in the hospital. And it's a big part of managing patients with COVID. Because just a couple of comments about the science around that. Our body learns to breathe based on our carbon dioxide level. It doesn't, oxygen levels don't motivate us to breathe that much. And that's the unique thing about COVID. It impacts what's called surfactant, some of the surface chemical in the lungs. And what happens to us is that we tend to lose our absorption of oxygen, but we're still able to get rid of carbon dioxide. So that's why you have these people that look like they're about to crump. They're about to just go really bad, but they're sitting there on their telephone. You know, they're in the ER with very low pulse ox, but they're on the telephone because they're feeling fine. They're just, they're able to get rid of that carbon dioxide, but they don't realize that they're not oxygenating very well. Joe's making a good point. He was saying, Doc, you need to get that article out there because we all need to get one. Well, here's the other side to that, Joe. Good luck if you can get one. Janice has been checking on those recently. We've got a lot of friends and patients in New York, and again, they were all surprised that we didn't have a pulse ox. I'm not. It's not something that I need to check my blood pressure. I need to check my weight, things like that on a regular basis. But I don't have oxidation oxygenation problems. Well, didn't have a need for that here until COVID-19. And so, again, I think there's going to be challenges in getting that, accessing that. We will take a little bit deeper look at it, go through the article, and talk about sourcing it. Previous topics that we've covered: pregnant women and coronavirus. Yes, it's not hitting pregnant women, unlike some of the recent seasonal flu. Who is immune to the coronavirus, and what does that mean? That is so critical in terms of getting us back out into the work world. A lot of states are starting to open up again. And what's going to be very interesting and critical is, are they opening? How do we know that we're no longer susceptible? That's not quite so simple as you might think. 6 conditions for ending lockdown. Unused coronavirus tests in labs. I mean, it's like, if there's one big problem in managing this pandemic, it's been getting enough tests. Then we start to get enough tests and we can't coordinate getting them out there. We've had several coverage items, topics on ACE receptors and blood pressure medicines, social distancing, herd immunity, and COVID-19 and heart damage. Several topics. If you have an interest, take a look. Not going to cover these, going to skip over a couple of these items. Again, we're looking to clean up some of the intro discussions. Chris wants to remind us, and as I do, that we've got access to telemedicine in your home. It helps with a lot of things. For example, we use e-prescribing, and if you need to check with your doc whether your doc's doing telemedicine or not. He or she needs to be doing e-prescribing, because that decreases the #1 cause of pharmacy errors, which is, look at the left hand, I think it's the left hand screen, it might be the right, it's the lower part of the screen here. And you look at doctors' handwritings. We make jokes about poor doctors' handwriting, and we don't think that that's the #1 cause. It's killed people, and it routinely still does. We'll be giving you some information on how to sign up for telemedicine if you like. A cost-effective way of dealing with heart attack, stroke, risk for COVID-19 if you get infection with SARS-CoV-2. All of these are responding very well in terms of understanding our insulin resistance, our prediabetes status, and there's a great way to do that. Most of us, unfortunately, are not getting that information from our doc. So again, the program today is going to be about looking at how we coordinate the treatment clinical trials. We'll do that right after Carl gives us the intro water ball. So we've heard about it multiple times. We heard about it, for example, with hydroxychloroquine. Came out, a lot of people talked about how great it was. It got a lot of press. People started discovering it in places like aquatic, tropical fish tank additives, and took it and died. Then you got studies that there's been a recent study that's been getting a lot of press. The VA study, which was showing, it's the largest study done so far in terms of looking at hydroxychloroquine, and it didn't help. In fact, it looked like people that didn't get hydroxychloroquine were doing worse. I mean, that did get hydroxychloroquine were doing worse. Before you pump the brakes on hydroxychloroquine completely, you need to look at that study. It basically showed, there appeared to be some bias in there. It appeared that the folks that were the sickest ended up getting hydroxychloroquine. Now, is that the case? It's impossible to tell right now. Is the door closed? Is the story over for hydroxychloroquine? No, it's not. Now, why did I go into that example? Because that's been one of the most important examples. It shows 2 or 3 things. Number one, there's a promising therapy. Number two, that therapy can be overused quickly, can be used inappropriately, and can even kill people. So it's not like these things are innocuous, harmless types of things. We need to study them. We need to know what we're doing. That's why most of these things are prescription, because things that are prescription usually have risk. Now, the FDA's made mistakes in that area. I've got issues there in terms of like metformin. I think metformin should be over the counter and aspirin should be prescription, but that's a different argument for a different time. It still makes the point that treatments are critical. Randomized clinical trials, it's one of the fastest ways to learning whether experimental products work, even in an emergency. This information, by the way, is being covered in an article from JAMA, Finding Effective Treatments for COVID-19, the Scientific Integrity and Public Confidence in a Time of Crisis. There's extreme resistance to clinical trials, RCTs, and one of the reasons is there's a perception that they're difficult to do. It takes years. Well, take a look. There have already been dozens of randomized clinical trials done on COVID-19. So by definition, you can do clinical trials rapidly and effectively. Another reason why people may be hesitant to start getting into a clinical trial for COVID-19 is that the pandemic may be waning. The perception that we're getting out of the woods on this. We're getting ready to go back to work, so it's not a big deal. I hope that there's not a lot of people feeling like it's not a big deal. I think the people that are going out, at least my perception, the vast majority of them that are going out are saying, yeah, it may be a big deal, but earning an income and getting the economy back up and rolling is a big deal too. Other reasons why there can be resistance to a clinical trial. The trial may be terminated before it can reach a definitive conclusion. That actually happened with a triple antibody therapy called ZMapp for Ebola treatment. For those of you that are interested in looking at and seeing the JAMA article that we're talking about, the link is right here at the bottom. And click on it, and there it is. So now let's talk about EUAs, emergency use authorizations. That became a big deal a few weeks ago when we were just getting started in terms of the antibody test. Tons of antibody tests were made available through EUA, Emergency Use Authorization. That's an FDA term, and it allows for the use of select experimental products or approved products for unproven indications. In other words, it's saying, look, it sounds reasonable. The FDA has not completely reviewed all of this, but we're saying, you know what, go ahead. We did that, as I mentioned, for antibody test kits. They routinely use EUAs for test kits, devices, and investigational drugs. Gosh, I'm having a technical problem. Thank you for your patience. The EUA is not a full FDA approval. Now, the guys that wrote this article, I don't necessarily completely agree with them. They're very anti-EUA. And I understand there's some problems with EUA. The public confidence in the FDA can be eroded if something goes wrong. I think the public confidence in the FDA is kind of shaky anyway. And they say it opens a floodgate to promote other unproven treatments. Now, I think they've got a point there. For example, when the FDA issued the EUA for chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, many touted the use of favipiravir. Well, now, why is that? And what is favipiravir? Well, favipiravir is an antiviral. I believe it was made in Japan, and there was a lot of push and pressure to say, you know what, let's go ahead and get that out there under an EUA as well. That, well-meaning as it may have been, may have also been had more risk than benefit. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later, I believe. So let's think about effective COVID-19 treatments and what should we do, and what is there a better way to coordinate this? Is there a way to turn that cacophony into a symphony? Well, you can look at what we've already begun doing in other spaces, things that didn't just happen 2 months ago. Regulatory and research committees can quickly learn when treatments are effective, back to conducting randomized clinical trials. We recently had one of the regulatory and research committees get together and just start plowing through treatment after treatment after treatment after treatment for COVID-19 that's been, these treatments that have been proposed and tried. I don't remember the quote from a couple of the participants, but you do know the outcome. It was like, we got nothing. It's important to optimize treatments that already exist, including supportive critical care. And obviously, it's important to find something that works. It's critical to protect the integrity of and the resulting public trust in the scientific and regulatory agencies and their advice and decisions. Again, I think the guys that wrote this article, when they say that, that's really a debatable point. I tend to look at the other side of that point. I think with the emergency challenges going on and the impact on lifestyle, the impact on the economy, reputation of scientific and regulatory agencies is already pretty stressed, pretty beat up at this point. So that was the coverage on helping to coordinate these research activities. Again, hundreds of randomized clinical trials going on, efforts to coordinate them better. And these guys were arguing about, let's do away with, or let's not do as many EUAs. Let's just do all clinical trials. I think they overstated that point for reasons that we discussed. Now, in the title, we talked about COVID-19 treatments. So we're going to go to another article. The link is down here. This is an article. It's from, it's updated therapies for COVID-19. It's more of a summary in terms of looking at specific items themselves, specific treatments. And let's just run through those real quick. I mentioned hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine a few minutes ago. Ionophore. The only COVID-19 treatment drugs with EUA at this point. In one of the first large studies, researchers found no evidence that the drug is effective at treating the virus. That was conducted at the Veterans Health Administration hospitals with 368 patients. Again, one of the largest hydroxychloroquine study done so far. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the intro to this discussion, don't be quite so quick to count out hydroxychloroquine. I don't think the story's quite over yet. Now, as we mentioned, there's been a lot of interest on antivirals. Remdesivir was something that came out of the blocks early with a lot of interest. It was one of 2 items that were listed on the CDC side as potential treatments. The first remdesivir studies, not so promising. These other studies, in fact, the vast majority of, if you look at these words, you'll see that there are patterns here. And if they end with VIR, they're probably an antiviral drug. Darunavir, favipiravir, lopinavir, and remdesivir. The favipiravir I mentioned a few minutes ago it was something that's been pushed under this EUA thing, and again, maybe not quite ready for prime time. So there are other therapies as well, and it was an interesting therapy that someone mentioned to me recently on one of these videos, and I did that thing where it's like a dog heard a high-pitched sound. I didn't realize exactly what they were talking about. I don't have that video available, but it's an immune system-based therapy where I think it's Regeneron is looking at taking frozen cells, immune cells from people that had the virus, thawing those cells out, using those immune cells to develop or to generate antibody. In other words, not just pulling antibody to COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, not just pulling antibody out of people, but actually taking the cells and using the cells to regenerate and multiply, and then using those cell lines to create antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. So again, something that's got significant promise, but it's not going to happen overnight. Convalescent plasma is just taking the plasma of people that have been sick, the blood plasma, pulling the antibodies out. FDA has issued guidance to provide recommendations for that. We've covered discussions about vitamin C therapy multiple times. There's been multiple discussions about vitamin C from a lot of different perspectives, a whole bunch of debates, and I've covered those early on. Not seeing a whole lot of change in the vitamin C story at this point. It really became amped up over the past year or so when a doc in an ICU doc in Virginia started using extremely high doses, several grams of vitamin C intravenously in ICU patients, critical care patients. He claimed to get miraculous results. I've covered those a couple of times. Although he got miraculous results, when others repeated that study, they didn't. So again, not quite ready for prime time to start just injecting everybody with significant vitamin C. Now, does that mean shouldn't use vitamin C? No, actually, I went back. I had stopped taking oral vitamin C on more of a preventive basis, and then went back and reminded myself, yeah, you know what? I need to be taking a gram or two. A lot of people take more than that. And then again, there's a lot more discussion about, well, should it be lysosomal vitamin C, et cetera? And clearly the debate about ascorbic acid versus vitamin C. Again, I don't think, I know there's a lot of debate around all of these issues. I don't think any of those are as clear as the folks debating it would make you believe. Obviously, the long-term bigger goal is to get a vaccine, something that helps our body. It challenges our body to create antibody, which will be effective against SARS-CoV-2 when and if we get that infection. And I think at some point, most of us are either going to get vaccinated or we're going to get the infection. It's just that infectious, that contagious, and it will be that prevalent. So, Carl, you want to show us the video? Carl?
An anti-malaria drug touted by President Trump as a game changer for COVID-19 showed no benefit according to an analysis of patients hospitalized in Veterans Health Administration medical centers. The analysis found the two primary outcomes for people treated with hydroxychloroquine were death and the need for mechanical ventilation. The analysis was conducted retrospectively based on data from patients hospitalized with confirmed COVID-19 infections in all VA medical centers until April 11, 2020. The study analyzed only 368 patients, but still the largest look at the outcomes of COVID-19 patients treated with hydroxychloroquine anywhere in the world.
So there you go. More bad news. That was our topic for today, our program topic. Let's go in and see what kind of interest we have. Yep, we've got quite a few people here interested, asking questions. Thank you, Carl, for getting that slide up there indicating that it's question and answer. As you may remember, oh gosh, I can't remember the name right now, but one of our folks said, could we clarify more when we transition into the Q&A. Good morning, Dave Murphy. How are you? I hope you're doing well. Good morning, Joe Riley. Hope you're doing well. Good morning, Robert Simpson, Mr. Awesome. Thank you very much. Are a number of vaccines required because of broad spectrum necessities? Not sure that I understand that question exactly, but here's one of the things that you'll find. A comparison with something like measles versus seasonal flu. Measles, we have a vaccine. It's fairly effective. You don't get a huge amount of changes with the measles virus, so you don't get a huge amount of changes with the vaccine. On the other hand, with seasonal flu, it's a different story. Seasonal flu actually has modular components for both its external shell and other parts of the virus. So that's why you have H1N2, H1N1 or H5N5, H5N1. What are those talking about? Those are different variations of the seasonal flu virus. H means hemagglutinin, so again, technical term, and N means neuraminidase, another technical term. But it doesn't matter what those terms are. What matters is they are plug-and-play components of the seasonal flu. As you know, if you get a vaccine for the wrong combination, it's totally worthless to you. So you've got variations out in that virus world. Like we've said multiple times, nothing is as simple as we'd like for it to be. You've got viruses like seasonal flu, which have very, very effective ways of avoiding and bypassing our immune system. That requires different vaccines for every different component of flu. And that's why you have these systems of surveillance throughout the world looking at, okay, what is the seasonal flu going to be this year? And we're watching flu as it develops and comes into the human population. Quite often it comes from the bird population. Quite often it comes from the pork population. That's why you hear swine flu and bird flu. You've heard those terms so many times. We're watching those populations, and we're watching the flu as it's being introduced into human populations, and watching for that transition from animal to human transmission to human transmission. And at that point, it becomes dangerous. It's exactly what happened with this one. And that's the definition of what we call an epizootic. Zootic meaning animals, and epi meaning coming from. So epizootic infections. My grandma used to call those epizootics. She really didn't know what they were, but she knew that it sounded bad. She used to tell me if I was out in the cold and wet. I remember one time my brother and I were washing the car, and we got into a fight about squirting each other down, and her term was something she often said: you're going to get the epizootics. Now, again, I started talking about my grandma and my brother and I getting into car wash battles and epizootics. Here's where it comes from. Again, there are some viruses that have a lot of variation, and therefore you have to have a huge amount of vaccine variation to match every one of those. And the flu is that example. There are other viruses like the measles and the childhood disease viruses that don't have that much variation. I think your question is going to be, well, what is that going to look like for COVID-19? SARS-CoV-2. I think it's going to be more on the latter, where it's going to be more stable. Does that mean we're going to get a vaccine over the next 6 months instead of 18 to 24? Not so sure. There's a lot of challenges in terms of developing any vaccine. And one of the challenges, you would say, well, maybe there's not that much risk. Maybe we ought to fast track it. There is risk. A couple of the risks that have happened, and we've talked about them before. There was a time when the vaccine appeared to be associated with paralysis, the vaccine for flu. In addition, there's been some evidence that vaccine might cause COVID-19, the more serious disease, as opposed to prevent it. Now, how would it do that? If you go back and you remember, COVID-19 is more of an inflammatory response to SARS-CoV-2 that we're seeing in folks that have high blood pressure, older males, and most of all, prediabetes. Then if you've already exposed someone to this virus, you may have created a situation where they're they create hyper inflammation as opposed to a normal lower amount. That's what some of the concerns are in terms of developing this vaccine. Thank you very much for that question. Jan H. Dr. Brewer, many thanks for your efforts. $20 to your cause as soon as I can get my wife Janice to use PayPal for me. Guys and gals, we got to pay to play. Thank you so much, at least for the thought. Some of that is, I don't know if you remember Popeye, and I can't remember what Popeye's friend's name was. It's, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Whether you make it there or not, thank you so much, Jan. I do appreciate, and I appreciate the reminders to other folks. We're getting this information out to help folks understand a little bit more about what we're dealing with COVID-19 and why you're seeing the reactions that you're seeing. Speaking of reactions, I had a couple of friends on. I spend maybe 15 minutes a month in Facebook, and usually when I do spend any time there, I'm getting something that Facebook is sending me, which we use in terms of marketing our channel. And a couple of the guys my age, 60 and older, heavy, got to be pre-diabetic, and they're complaining about us overreacting to lockdowns and the impact, and saying people don't understand what the impact of this is and the impact of a negative economy. I agree with that 100%, but I think there's just an interesting correlation that the guys that a lot of the folks that tend to be focusing on this the most are the guys that have the highest risk. They are the guys that are older, male, pre-diabetic, and most likely to have COVID-19, the killer disease if they get this infection. I'm not saying any of these groups are right. Again, just trying to point out that sometimes it's the very folks we're trying to save that are the most reticent to a countermeasure. Robert Simpson, good morning, Mr. Okay, we covered that. Thank you very much. I saw Dave Murphy. I saw an article about NAC. That's N-acetylcysteine. May boost glutathione. It does boost glutathione. In fact, if you take glutathione orally, you probably don't get very much of it. The digestive system and the stomach acids probably burn up most of it before you can ever get it in. But if you take N-acetylcysteine, you get a little bit better response. So you saw an article, you saw that it may boost glutathione inside the body and help the body's immune response to COVID-19. Not a cure, but maybe help. Yeah, any of the things that improve with inflammation. I've got several videos on glutathione and some of the and NAC, N-acetylcysteine, and some of the science and hopefully helpful information around that. Thanks for bringing it up, Dave. Got my pulse ox from Amazon a couple of years ago. Smart move. Wonder what made you think to do that. I'd love to hear. Not too expensive, as I recall. No, these aren't. I remember looking at them at one point, and they were like $20. 96%. That's probably Dave's oxygen level, which is a good number. 65 beats per minute. Sitting here watching you. Well, thank you very much for the update. Let's see what else we've got here. Jerry West, nearly 50% of deaths in the US are in the New York area. Remarkably low compared with Europe in most of the United States. Yes, and have you seen any of those model numbers? There's a lot of concern about, okay, how low is it and how comfortable are we gonna that it will remain low, especially when Georgia's opening up tattoo parlors and you name it. Makes you a little bit nervous. Again, it's a lot of that's very easy for me to say. I'm an old retired guy and I work out of my home already. So it doesn't have that kind of impact on my life. So it's very easy for me to start saying, let's just keep everybody locked down. That is a huge item. That is the item of the month and will be the item of the year in terms of debate. Dave Murphy, thanks again, $5 contribution. I can't tell you, especially Dave, you've been very reliable in terms of going ahead and making contributions. And when somebody like you does that, it helps other people think about, I value this information. We've got somebody who's using their resources to, my training, my background, and the money that we're paying our staff to help coordinate the decks. Chris is organizing the decks, getting the information out. Carl is on with me at every one of these meetings. As you've seen, he's bailed me out a few times when I forget to do things like share my screen. So it does take money to get this done. I do appreciate you guys making a contribution. ER Forest, my mistake. Broad spectrum is in relation to bacterial antibiotics. Yeah, and thanks. Joe Riley, 95%, 74. Thanks for sharing. Amazon has them. Thanks for sharing that. And I haven't looked recently, obviously. Let me go take a look. Again, thanks, Joe, for suggesting the article, reminding me of the topic, because I do think it's very important. I agree with you. It's something that folks need to know about. And number 3, fact-checking me on whether it's available. I had just, I love to tell Janice that my most common and worst mistake is listening to her. Obviously, she likes to ignore that comment. The vast majority, she has the opposite viewpoint. But yeah, I haven't looked up pulse ox on the Amazon myself. Thank you for doing that. And again, Janice told me, she made an assumption, I think, that these would not be available. My guess is not enough people know about them and the importance and the fact that they can be life-saving if you get coronavirus infection, because it gives you an early warning. Here again, just to repeat maybe one of the main points of the intro, and it's a point that we'll make next week as well. This virus is very deceptive. It decreases your ability to bring in oxygen, to oxygenate, but it does not impact your ability to get rid of your carbon dioxide. It's not oxygen. Most people think I'm breathing for oxygen, I'm pushing for oxygen. That's not what's going on. That's not what drives our brain in terms of telling us to breathe. It's CO2. And that's what's unique and interesting, but far more than interesting, extremely dangerous about this virus. people start losing their ability to oxygenate, but they don't know it. Why do they not know it? Because they're able to get rid of CO2. That's where this pulse ox comes into play. And again, thank you, Joe, for the reminder and keeping after me on this. This is a team event, a team activity. We've got Janice on the team, Chris on the team, Carl and Lori, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. And we've mentioned several times Janice's sister, Pam, has been doing some great work in terms of digging through articles that are important to folks, which raise and answer questions that folks need to be thinking about. My goodness, we got the $20 from Jan H. I do appreciate that. So next one, as usual, you're right, Doc. Checked Amazon. The Pulse Ox was only 16, but currently out of stock. Glad I already have mine. Well, maybe Amazon can't imagine that Amazon would have them for Joe Riley, but not for Dave Murphy. Interesting. We'll have to dig a little bit deeper this weekend and deal with that on Monday. Ken S., some phones have a pulse ox built in. My Samsung Note 8 has one. That is interesting. Very interesting. Didn't know that, Ken. Thank you for sharing. Ellen Duhan, question for future program. Do the ozone generator lights and UV lights help make our home environment free of these little pests? It's a good question. I will tell you this. One of the groups I'm working with is a group that's doing environmental cleanup for things like pharma. You know, these pharma and other work organizations, work environments where when they find out that they've got COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 contamination, they have to shut down, do a complete clean. We have not been talking at all yet about using ozone or ultraviolet lights. All of the discussion for these cleanups, these environmental work area cleanups, has focused around, what is it, hypochlorous or hydrochloric acid. This is a wimpy virus in terms of standing up to that acid. Why ozone and UV lights have not become part of the discussion, I don't know. I'm suspicious that, I just don't know. I have a friend, Chuck Smith, who owns and runs a company called Guardian Manufacturing in Florida. And he's done a huge amount of work at Guardian with ozone. One of the areas where they've had the most success, and it's been very successful, is ozone disinfectant of fruits for grocery stores. Why that hasn't translated back into more hard surfaces, inanimate surfaces, plastics, steels, other metals, don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. Thanks for bringing it up. Dave, I see one available for $49. That's Joe talking to Dave Murphy about availability of pulse ox. On A, not sure what that means. Jackie Shaheen, do you know what the oxygen millimeters per mercury level is for intubation with COVID-19? You start getting worried about patients when they start getting below 94, 95%. Joe, thanks. Just checked the one I purchased and it's out of stock. Didn't search any further. Thanks again for the correction. So sounds like Joe's right. And it sounds like my wife was right. No, wait a minute. Which is it? Well, I think that maybe it's not too clear just how much availability, easy for me to say, you have for pulse oximetry. Ron Clark, article in How Direct Sunlight Kills the Virus. Yes, Ron, there's no question that direct sunlight does kill the virus. I think the question is how to apply that within a home or work environment area. Uh, here's Joe Riley. Milk it for all it's worth. Thank you again, Joe. I appreciate that. David Cheney, truck drivers are still working and truck stops are open. Truck stops are open. Any stats on truckers and how they compare with to the public for COVID-19? No, obviously a huge question, David, because again, the truckers are a key component of keeping the economy alive, and more than just the economy, life-saving access to life-saving equipment, life-saving access to food, access to things that we need in terms of our lives. David Murphy, I'm suspecting because of that big rig on your picture that you may have a little bit to do with trucking, and if you have any knowledge of stuff going on in the epidemiology of COVID-19 with truckers, be very, very interested to hear that. And thanks, David Cheney, for bringing it up. Thanks, Jan, for the contribution. Rick McMahon, I'll pay you later for hamburger. Wimpy, that's right. Thank you, Rich. Thanks for the reminder. But as you saw, that was not Jan's perspective. Jan, thank you again, Jan. And okay. Jan H, couldn't find the PayPal icon. Hope this doesn't come back to haunt me. Thanks, Carl. Not sure why I'd come back to haunt you. Craig Morgan, ozone chelation therapy, is it effective against COVID? You know, well, I think you're going to have to define for me the pairing of ozone and chelation therapy. Ozone is, it's where you're breathing ozone. Some people are trying to absorb it through the skin. And chelation is where you have an IV and you're given some things that are like chelation type of items. And I'll tell you, I've been involved, not delivering both, but actually investigating them because I focus on prevention. I get a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of different types of therapy, whether it's supplements, ozone, chelation, you name it, that are just adamant that their product, their therapy works, and push me on that issue. And as you may have guessed, I tend to push back. And I haven't gotten not aware of a whole lot of really good evidence for either one of those, ozone or chelation therapy, in terms of helping humans treat or prevent any type of problem. Okay, so JT, French have observed that smokers are less likely to catch COVID-19. An anti-intuitive result given smoking damage to lungs. And they suspect nicotine prevents COVID-19. Thoughts? Very interesting topic. A new friend of mine, Laura Friedman, who's doing the work with she owns Homestead and founded Homestead. It's a CBD oil company, very good group. She actually had Laura's lean beef a couple of decades ago, had the guts to get in there and fight with the standard old, good old boy, Western guys with the 10-gallon hats running the meat industries 20, 30 years ago. And she competed very effectively. She sold Laura's lean beef and is now focused totally on CBD. She alerted me to this issue of, is it really nicotine that causes the problems with smoking? And there's significant evidence that the answer is no. It's not it isn't crystal clear exactly what causes the problems with smoking. I will tell you this, it is crystal clear that smoking is horrendous on health. Now, the point that you're bringing up with French raising this issue, one of the questions that you have is, well, could you use things like other ways of delivering nicotine, and would that help? Totally conjecture right now. And in fact, still the question is, what do we know about nicotine and its impact on health? Dealing with that specific issue, that question of, is nicotine what causes the tobacco problem? Many people have said, no, maybe it's not nicotine, maybe it's the chemicals in smoke. There are a lot of different chemicals, polyphenols, and a bunch of other things, which might be an issue there. However, just logically, you got to stop and think, and maybe it's not smoke, because snuff and chewing tobacco both cause huge risk for oral cancers. So it's probably more than just the smoke. What is it? We don't know yet. And back to your point, JT, about nicotine and COVID-19. I don't have any major hope for nicotine being a big deal. I'm sure, though, that it's being investigated along with hundreds of other things as we continue to wade through this mire. Okay, Karen Black, any suggestions for husband's high blood pressure at night? Keto for nearly 2 years. We use Omega or Omron, I think you meant Omron, O-M-R-O-N, blood pressure machine. It takes an average of 3 readings. He takes multiple readings a day. Well, the vast majority of high blood pressure that you see are related to and responsive to 2 things. One is aging. As we get older, we tend to get hypertensive. Just like as we get older, we tend to get pre-diabetic, lose our ability to metabolize carbs. Now, there's not much you can do about that. However, there is something you can do about high blood pressure in most cases. The vast majority of cases that I've seen were also very sensitive to being overweight. I have it. Nobody would consider me to be overweight. Most folks wouldn't. Anyway, I've got a BMI around, it varies between 21, 22. If I gain 5 pounds, my blood pressure goes up. If I lose 5 pounds, my blood pressure goes back down. And this is not about me. I'm sharing my own story, but it's to make this point that I've seen very few people, including people that have a BMI at 21 and 22, which is not that common, who don't respond very well to loss of weight. It's that same old thing. Now, there also, there's a whole bunch of stuff about blood pressure. Up until COVID-19, one of my go-to medications were in the ACE receptors. Obviously, a boatload of discussion about ACE receptor medications, the ACE inhibitors and the ARBs, regarding blood pressure for this specific time period. Bottom line is, people that are on it, including myself, do not recommend. Neither myself nor dozens of other standards committees that have taken a deep dive into this issue. None of us are recommending that people get off of their ACE inhibitors or ARBs. Now, the one question is for people that are newly diagnosed with blood pressure, and I've had a few over the past month, and given that information, we're not starting people right out of the blocks on blood pressure treatment with ACEs and ARBs, starting usually with a calcium channel blocker. I had a patient actually yesterday that we were talking about this, and he was saying, oh no, I don't want to take those beta blockers. I've had them before. Beta blockers and calcium channel blockers are 2 totally different types of medications. And most of us, as we continue to get older, we continue to go down that path of getting worse and worse blood pressure, just like we continue to go down that path of getting more and more insulin resistant. And as that happens with our blood pressure, we start off, for example, quite often being managed very well with one type of blood pressure medicine. Again, usually ACE inhibitors or ARBs, for me at least, and for, again, more and more docs. As we get older, the blood pressure continues to get worse. We usually, sooner or later, need to add a second type of medication. So again, for me, it was usually starting off with an ACE or ARB. And then as the patient continued to age into needing a second line, then go to calcium channel blockers. We've reversed that now, where we say, look, if you're getting started now, you need to go into calcium channel blockers first. Philip Nichols, New York antibody test surveys, 20%. Isn't that interesting? 20% may have antibodies. New York, king of convalescent plasma. Very, very interesting information. New York City, 20% kind of numbers. And again, it was like, no wonder you saw the disaster that you saw there. Other areas, rural areas of New York, nothing like that. And again, other areas of the country, nothing like that. I have to go back and say, it reminds me of, gosh, was it 30 years ago or 20 years ago? Somewhere in between. I was on the Maryland Governor's AIDS Task Force. It was right when the AIDS pandemic was getting started. And we saw the same thing. A major, again, you could have questions about whether it started in the Caribbean, started in Africa, started somewhere else. But in the US, it really started in New York, just like COVID. And why is that? Because the travel comes in from the rest of the world to New York. And then after New York, then you start seeing it in Cincinnati, LA, you start seeing it in the other big cities where it's just traveling. And unfortunately, these things travel by airplane before we know they're a problem. Well, we caught things, you could say we caught things way too late with COVID-19. You could also make the position that we caught it early. At least it's not like the whole country was already inundated with it before we found out. Clearly would have been far better to catch it earlier. But very interesting points. And your point about convalescent plasma, it's a good point. Philip Nichols, convalescent plasma may help prevent or help already infected people. For sure, no question. Bruce McDonald, hello all. So Dave Murphy, so going to answer that question. Yes, I drive a large wrecker. Oh, that's what that is. I'm out every day towing semis. Fortunately, I haven't run into anyone with COVID-19 yet, but taking precautions. Very, very good to hear you're doing that. Masks, gloves, disinfectant whenever possible. Thank you for sharing that, Dave. Jesus Life, what about absence of zinc in the hydroxychloroquine VA tests? It's a good point. I think one of I'm trying to remember what the combinations were. There were like 3 groups, zinc only, zinc plus, I think it was zinc plus azithromycin. And maybe nothing. I can't remember what the 3rd group was. I think you're right. Now that you mention it, I'm not sure that they even mentioned zinc in the study. And it's like, if this is being set up as an ionophore, if the mechanism is truly being an ionophore, in other words, getting that zinc ion through the cell membrane so it can slow down SARS-CoV's hijacking of the genetic material, then maybe that's part of the problem with the VA study. Philip Nichols, does plasma need to be matched to blood type? I don't know. It doesn't. Dave Murphy, I'm mostly local and home every night normally. I know there's been some concern for the over-the-road drivers and where they would go if symptomatic. Haven't seen a good answer to this question. Joe Riley, never been killed by a cigarette. I wasn't smoking. Very good point. Steve Mitchum, Doc, what are your thoughts on the therapeutic fasting for insulin insensitivity? Fasting is a big deal. It's hard. It's harder when you start it, but you know what? It's hard whenever you start fasting. It takes discipline. I have a lot of people that Fasting is very, very helpful. There's no question about that. Now, is it going to permanently reverse insulin sensitivity? No, I don't think so. I've got too many people that use fasting a lot. Excuse me. Fasting is something that should be a part of your routine lifestyle. There are multiple types of fasting. There is intermittent fasting, which means the most common type of intermittent fasting is skipping breakfast. And when you go back and you look at some of the old data about what we called caloric restriction, that is just keeping the calories down, a lot of the science may have been hidden effect of intermittent fasting. Now, why was that? Because if you look at the lab animals, they would give them one amount of food per day at one sitting. So the rats were competing with each other for the food. So they'd eat it all at once, and then they'd have no food for the rest for another 24 hours. Getting great results in terms of longevity and health. They thought originally that was all because of decreased calories. And then they began to realize, no, you're also setting up intermittent fasting for those lab animals. No question, there's tons and tons of information that's out there which shows decreased inflammatory responses, huge improvement in metabolism. If you look at Walter Longo's research on lab animals, he has created pure diabetes with streptozocin. It's a chemical that wipes out the pancreas in lab animals. Created pure brittle, really bad type 2 diabetes. Subjected these lab animals to fasting mimicking diets and returned their ability to make insulin, cured their diabetes. So in fact, as I've done a lot of work with that group and with the fasting mimicking diet, Prolon, got a lot of people on it, have had a lot of people on it for a long time. One of the things you noticed is that a lot of people were taking Prolon just to deal with their prediabetes. They had heard and read some of the research that it really does have a positive impact. There's no question in my mind that it does. Like everything else, it's not quite that simple. Does it cure it indefinitely? No. I think it has a very positive impact. Can you do some fasting and then pork back up again? No, you can't do that. Can you get rid of a lot of the impact of the negative impact on your health? Absolutely. I've got people that are full-blown diabetic, and I see this routinely. They come into my practice and they've got they've got blood sugars in the OGTT, the glucose tolerance test, getting plenty of blood sugars over 200, 230, 250. Yet they start watching their carbs. They lose the weight that they need to lose. They lose that body fat mass. And then they get to where their blood sugars never go over 120. So in effect, it's like Jason Fung in all of his books. He says, you can cure, quote, cure diabetes. Well, it's clear that you can prevent any of the basic problems associated with diabetes for the most part, for the vast majority of us. To your point, Steve Mitchum, fasting is a key component of getting that done. If there were one thing that I would want to deal with it on a legacy basis, it's the pandemic of diabetes and prediabetes. That's what's killing us, even more so than COVID-19. And for the most part, that's the difference between an asymptomatic infection with SARS-CoV-2 and killer COVID-19 problems. As you see from the statistics that we put in the beginning of these videos, even during the height of the COVID-19 outbreak, you can clearly make a case that diabetes and prediabetes are killing more of us than COVID-19, than SARS-CoV-2. We've known that for a long time. we just consider it to be, quote, normal, okay, for somebody to have a heart attack or stroke when they hit their 60s and 70s. It's not. Dave Murphy, keto carnivore along with intermittent fasting has been extremely effective for me. Lost over 100 pounds in the last 16 months. Wow. Obviously, a huge impact on your longevity, Dave. You've probably, you know, depending on what else goes on with your life, you may have saved yourself 2 or 3 healthy decades of life. I expected this was going to be one of those shorter versions. Carl, obviously it's not. We've had a lot of great Q&A. What I would ask is, again, that we continue to start looking at ways we can take the program component, separate that out, and do that as a little brief 10-minute video for those that want to review the issue, the program issue. I was going to say goodbye. We've got a couple of others, and then we'll wrap it up. JT, bleach injections as a cure. Pardon my response. I know I saw the news. My wife always watches the news this morning. Be careful where you get your advice. Bleach is gonna, and that's sort of like thinking you breathe in sauna, hot air. If the treatment's going to kill more people than the cure, don't start thinking about injecting bleach. Thank you, Doc. Currently in day 3 of a fast, hard in the beginning, but gets easier over time. No question. Dennis Williamson, sun, heat, and humidity are current buzzwords. Dr. Ken Berry is recommending UVA for hypertension and overall health support. His YouTube video has been supporting clinical studies. I'm very familiar with Ken Berry. He himself, I think, lost, what was it, 30, 50, 100 pounds? Major proponent for keto. And I think recently he's even lost more weight going on the carnivore diet. Steve Mitchum, congratulations, Dave Murphy. I would agree. Local CHGL, any known effective treatments for government tyranny? We can't help but get political every now and then, but I'm not touching that one. Thanks, Steve, from David. Farrokh Farr. Farrokh is in Iran, where huge issues associated with COVID-19. His perspective is it's the smoke. It will cover ACE2 receptors with CO2 and 1,500 other chemicals and mucus. No place for the virus to touch down. Thanks, Dr. Brewer, for what you do. Thank you for the acknowledgement, and thank you guys for your interest and attention. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. Carl, are you there?